This particular scene has received quite a bit of attention, although not as much as the pool sequence. We will describe it as the mandatory dance sequence or dance sequence in a teen drama. Essentially, we've already had the scene in which Ruby's walked in the door, the world has stopped for James, and he stared at her with hard eyes. I can only assume that he is waylaid by Elaine for a long period of time, because there is a gap between the time in which she enters the room and in which she has a conversation with Lydia, and then she has the conversation with James. The reason why dance sequences have become such an integral trope in romance series like this is because for as long as there have been these sorts of stories, dancing has essentially been a stand-in for sex. So if you take it right back to the days when before a woman was allowed to waltz at a ball, she had to have permission from the patronesses. Waltzing was considered particularly scandalous because it involved actual physical contact between the man and the woman. I think 2 points. Their hands would hold, the other hand arm would be around the waist. And in the old days, they used to mandate that there would have to be a minimum physical distance between the couples, even when they were waltzing. This was in contrast to the other dances that didn't require the same degree of consent from the patronesses, and those were the country dances, which I think would be quite similar to the square dances I think that you see today, as in the couples would be in formation, there would be the occasional hand clasps, but the movements of the dance mean that the couples are constantly moving away from one another and together, so there's not the same degree of intimacy. I have no idea whether it was intentional in this particular sequence, but if you watch the dance sequence from the time when they do their first goofy dance to the slow dance, there does seem to be something of a parallel to that. So if you watch the first dance, they're dancing next to one another. There isn't a huge amount of physical contact. It's a bit more casual, playful, lots and lots of eye contact, which is pretty sexy, but it's very much they're dancing next to each other. And then the mood shifts and they go into the very standard tropey dance, slow dance, which is essentially sex without having sex. But again, I really felt like the show did it very well because I have no idea whether it was deliberate, but if you watch that sequence, it's still quite demure and tastefully done, and yet is incredibly, how do I say? It's still quite erotic at the same time. We will go through it when we actually go through the video, um, but yeah, it's quite interesting the way they've chosen to do it. So as Lydia finishes up her conversation with Ruby, we get to what I call the next Beaufort will see you, because she essentially walks off and leaves Ruby on the dance floor, looking around in bewilderment, feeling very much like a fish out of water and all by herself. It is kind of funny though. I had to laugh when I saw this sequence, mainly because James seems to have supernatural vampire powers, which enable him to appear out of nowhere so that Ruby can collide into him. We see him do it at the dance here, but you may recall that he demonstrated this superpower after the lacrosse game as well. So James shows up just in time for Ruby to crash into him, and presumably he has ditched Elaine, and he looks so adorably pleased to see her, and she looks really shy and pleased to see him as well, and so it's one of those super cute sequences that you love to see in a teen drama, but it's acted well, so it's not cheesy, and it seems quite genuine. And then he puts out his hand to lead her to the dance floor, and it's almost like it's asking for her permission. So I think that's quite sweet in the sense that he doesn't just assume that she wants to dance with him, but he makes her the offer. I think it's interesting that the way they choose to play this scene is that she's sort of following his lead. She seems a bit unsure. I'm not sure whether they're implying she's not experienced with dancing and sex, or whether or not it's just that she's not familiar with dancing with him. But as you can see, they get familiar with one another really fast, and this is just an incredibly cute scene in which they're cutting loose, they're just dancing with each other, they don't care what anyone else thinks. And so that's why I was able to watch the scene without any cringe, whereas normally I would be cringing at dance sequences like this. I just thought this was really fun. And as I mentioned before, you can see that they're dancing near each other. They get quite close from time to time, but it is essentially a distance dance. As we move into the slow and sexy dance portion of the dance trope, I want to call attention to the fact that this scene is done quite subtly. We'd already seen a little bit earlier that he put his hand out to her to lead her to the dance floor so that she could choose whether to go with him or not. Similarly, in this sequence, I don't know whether they're still playing with the parallels between dancing and sex, but you can see that they have decided to have Ruby demonstrate a degree of uncertainty as she looks into his eyes during the slow music, as if she's not quite sure what to do next, what he might want to do, what she might want to do. So I don't think that they're implying that she doesn't know how to dance, but maybe she doesn't know how to slow dance. And there's sort of an implication that she might be not particularly experienced sexually. I don't know whether or not that's a reach, but I did think it was interesting because Ruby comes across as quite confident, so it was a little bit strange to see her looking so uncertain in this particular scene, but it could have just been fish out of water and also new relationship. The other thing that I wanted to call out to your attention before we watch this next scene is that in all dance sequences, especially when they're a slow dance like this, you will usually see the guy go for a grope because it's, again, a parallel with sex. So the trope we will see is his hands will wander. You'll see a slow shot of him drifting his hand over her breast and then down the curve of her butt. What I really liked in this scene is that that is not what happens. If you watch here, hearkening back to what I mentioned about the waltz, he actually just puts his hands around her waist very carefully and slowly to give her full opportunity to pull away if she's not comfortable. And then after he puts his hands around her waist, she then is the one that chooses to put her arms around his neck. And so she's accepting the intimacy. But even after they do all of that, there's none of the dance floor groping that you'll see in so many of the other romantic stories that we've seen. They are still essentially just waltzing with one another. They're very close to one another. They get quite close to kissing. It's a very slow and intimate dance. It's barely a dance, to be honest. But there's also some really beautiful focus on their clasped hands, which again I think is what makes this scene so different from a lot of other romantic dance scenes, particularly teen dramas. And I think it makes it not only romantic, but it's also very erotic, given how restrained it is. I also think it's quite realistic. If you think about it, even though these two have been interacting for a period of time, they've only had their period of accord for a very, very short period of time. They still don't know each other very well. They're getting to know one another. I think it would have been quite abrupt to have him immediately start feeling her up on the dance floor, to be quite honest. That would have really taken me out of the moment, and it would have been very jarring for the nature of their relationship. By the way, I don't want you to think that I'm against the boob grope, as I so romantically put it. when we eventually do see that rather tropey sequence of a hand drifting down a breast, it is very much an earned moment, and it's a lot later in the story and a lot later in the relationship. And it's not just done on a dance floor the first time they've really, really been close to one another. So as I mentioned, we have the uncertainty from Ruby. The very polite hand at the waist. He is not going for a grope. It's very restrained. They're clearly going for Jane Austen levels of sexual tension here, but that makes it way more romantic, I think.
Danke für das Kleid.
The next sequence makes me laugh because she takes her arms down purely just so he can spin around dramatically like this. Otherwise, there's really no reason for her to have done that. But the hand clasp is very lovely. So as mentioned, this is actually an extremely subtle love scene, subtle sex scene. They are very attracted to one another. They would want more, but the fact that they're being so restrained is actually what makes it romantic. And then they interrupt the trope with another trope, which is that Elaine pours water down her.
Kam genau richtig. War heiß hier.
Lass uns abhauen.
The only thing I will say about the end of that scene is that it is very much a trope to interrupt imminent sex or an imminent kiss with another action. And so this series has done that a few times. A few of their kisses have been interrupted. In this particular sequence, it's the jealous quasi-ex that interrupts them with a glass of water. It was interesting that they have Ruby as the one basically standing up to her and sort of dismissing the action and diffusing the situation. James doesn't really do anything here except give Elaine a bit of a death glare, but he doesn't reproach her or say anything. Not quite sure how I feel about that. I think that some series would have had him behaving a little bit more protectively or accusatory. I'm probably okay with the way they handled it, but I did think it was an interesting approach.